Okay, so if you're wondering what that just meant, I was using a language called ASL, which stands for American Sign Language. And American Sign Language is primarily used by deaf people in our society. So what I just said was, hi, my name is Abby Landry, and today I'm going to be teaching you all about deaf culture. So for my oral presentation, I'm teaching you all about deaf culture norms and how deaf people have taken so many strides to be fitted into a world that's built for hearing people primarily. And also, I've been taking ASL since 7th grade, so I've learned a lot about their culture along the way, and I've been able to be granted the New York State Seal of Biliteracy, which deems me fluent in ASL in the study of their culture. So I've gotten a lot of opportunities to work with deaf people and see what their community is like firsthand. Through my school, I've been able to go to deaf comedy shows, cook with deaf chefs, and speak to deaf people firsthand through sign language. And to start off, in the deaf community, to really learn the cultural norms, you have to understand that there's people who really embrace the deaf culture and there's people who don't want anything to do with it. So you could think of it like this. There's deaf culture with a capital D, and then there's deaf culture with a lowercase d. So the people who fit into the category of deaf culture with a capital D would be the people who love sign language. They're proud of sign language and they're proud of their community and love being involved in deaf culture. Then we have the people who are deaf with a lowercase d. In that category, it's the people who try to adapt to the hearing world as much as they can, and they don't want to be included in deaf culture by any means. And they try as much as they can to stray away from it. So, in the Deaf Culture Center article, What is Deaf Culture? I learned about so many different deaf culture norms, some that I knew of, some that I didn't, and it was a really good learning experience for me and hopefully for you right now. So, to start off, when communicating, deaf people, they use their eyebrows and their face very exaggerated, super dramatic, because that's how they show their feelings and that's how they get their point across. Also in deaf culture, it's super important to maintain eye contact. Whereas in hearing culture, this is totally different, because if you're talking to someone in the classroom, your family members, your friends, you don't have to directly look at them the entire time to get the point across that you're engaged and focused. But in deaf community, you need to be looking at them so they understand that you're understanding what they're saying. Another thing about deaf community that differs from the hearing world is that when you're in a crowded space and you need to walk through two people's conversation, you say, just being polite, oh my god, I'm sorry, I just have to get right through, excuse me. In deaf culture, this is not polite if you do this, and it's only polite if you walk directly through their conversation with no interruption. So this isn't interrupting their communication. Another thing that deaf culture differs from hearing culture is when deaf people are communicating, they often stay very close together and very present to each other because they don't have the opportunity, like I do, a hearing person, to yell across the room if need be to communicate. So, beside from the norms of deaf culture, there's also something called deaf space, and you may be thinking, what is deaf space? Deaf space is a term coined by the deaf community, which talks about how deaf people accommodate themselves in a hearing world. So, the Gallaudet University, which is a college primarily for deaf students in America, they explain in an article about deaf space how classrooms are U-shaped. And in our hearing world, we have so many different seating configurations in a class that don't alter or change or abrupt communication at all. But in a deaf classroom, most of the time, the seats are in a U shape, so everybody has the opportunity to look at each other, because deaf language is a visual language, and if you can't see each other, you can't communicate. That's taking away your communication. So, also, in classrooms and schools, there's often bigger walkways and hallways, so students can walk more in a line and not behind each other, so they have easier opportunities to communicate with each other. And deaf space doesn't just extend to the classroom, it also is in your home. Many deaf people strategically take down walls, or they put up mirrors and place lights in places where they can keep a visual connection. And besides from that, we have in deaf culture, literature is so important. Literature is really valued in deaf culture just like it is in hearing culture, because it teaches children values, lessons, and morals. And in deaf culture, they want kids to show the deaf experience through literature, and they want to teach them that deaf experience. So in the Handspeak article titled Literature of Deaf Artists and Writers, they talk about the different ways that deaf literature is produced, and a lot of it is through ABC stories, which is stories just like ABC, And then you go through a story using those hand movements all the way through the alphabet. The same thing with number stories, which is 1, 2, 3. And you go through all the numbers saying a story, poetry, and all deaf language is and literature is all visual. So it's not a written language, so all of their literature is visual literature. And another important to the deaf community is the way that they order their sentences. And the website LifePrint has an article on deaf word order where they explain the differentiation, where I would say, today I ate sushi. But as a deaf person, I would say, today, me, sushi, eat. Deaf people talk in a time, subject, object, verb, matter, and this is just how they communicate. This is what's easier for them, and this is their way of life. So overall, deaf community has a very diverse set of rules and norms, and I hope you learned some about it today.